Welcome to our YouTube channel. We share quality timeless classic audiobooks in business, leadership and self-development to expand your mind. Like, subscribe, and share for more quality content.
Japan during Musashi's lifetime. Miyamoto Musashi was born in 1584 in a Japan struggling to recover from more than 4 centuries of internal strife. The traditional rule of the emperors had been overthrown in the 12th century, and although each successive emperor remained the figurehead of Japan, his powers were very much reduced. Since that time, Japan had seen almost continuous civil war between the provincial lords, warrior monks and brigands, all fighting each other for land and power. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the lords, called daimyo, built huge stone castles to protect themselves, and their lands and castle towns outside the walls began to grow up. These wars naturally restricted the growth of trade and impoverished the whole country. In 1573, however, one man, Oda Nobunaga, came to the fore in Japan. He became shogun, or military dictator, and for 9 years succeeded in gaining control of almost the whole of the country. When Nobunaga was assassinated in 1582, a commoner took over the government. Toyotomi Hideyoshi continued the work of unifying Japan which Nobunaga had begun, ruthlessly putting down any traces of insurrection. He revived the old gulf between the warriors of Japan, the samurai and the commoners, by introducing restrictions on the wearing of swords. Hideyoshi's sword hunt, as it was known, meant that only samurai were allowed to wear 2 swords, the short one which everyone could wear, and the long one which distinguished the samurai from the rest of the population. Although Hideyoshi did much to settle Japan and increase trade with the outside world, by the time of his death in 1598, internal disturbances still had not been completely eliminated. The real isolation and unification of Japan began with the inauguration of the Great Tokugawa rule. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a former associate of both Hideyoshi and Nobunaga, formally became shogun of Japan after defeating Hideyoshi's son Hideyori at the Battle of Sekigahara. Ieyasu established his government at Edo, present-day Tokyo, where he had a huge castle. His was a stable, peaceful government beginning a period of Japanese history which was to last until the imperial restoration of 1868, for although Ieyasu himself died in 1616, members of his family succeeded each other, and the title shogun became virtually an hereditary one for the Tokugawas. Ieyasu was determined to ensure his and his family's dictatorship. To this end, he paid lip service to the emperor in Kyoto, who remained the titular head of Japan, while curtailing his duties and involvement in the government. The real threat to Ieyasu's position could only come from the lords, and he effectively decreased their opportunities for revolt by devising schemes whereby all lords had to live in Edo for alternate years, and by placing great restrictions on traveling. He allotted land in exchange for oaths of allegiance and gave the provincial castles around Edo to members of his own. The Tokugawa period marks a great change in the social history of Japan. The bureaucracy of the Tokugawas was all-pervading. Not only were education, law, government and class controlled, but even the costume and behavior of each class. The traditional class consciousness of Japan hardened into a rigid class structure. There were basically 4 classes of person: samurai, farmers, artisans and merchants. The samurai were the highest in esteem if not in wealth, and included the lords, senior government officials, warriors, and minor officials and foot soldiers. Next in the hierarchy came the farmers, not because they were well thought of, but because they provided the essential rice crops. Their lot was a rather unhappy one, as they were forced to give most of their crops to the lords and were not allowed to leave their farms. Then came the artisans and craftsmen, and last of all the merchants, who, though looked down upon, eventually rose to prominence because of the vast wealth they accumulated. Few people were outside this rigid hierarchy. Musashi belonged to the samurai class. We find the origins of the samurai class in the Kandai, stalwart youth, system established in 792 AD, whereby the Japanese army, which had until then consisted mainly of spear-wielding foot soldiers, was revived by stiffening the ranks with permanent training officers recruited from among the young sons of the high families. These officers were mounted, wore armor, and used the bow and sword. In 782 the Emperor Kamu started building Kyoto, and in Kyoto, he built a training hall which exists to this day called the Butakidan, meaning Hall of the Virtues of War. Within a few years of this revival, the fierce Ainu, the aboriginal inhabitants of Japan who had until then confounded the army's attempt to move them from their wild lodgings, were driven far off to the northern island, Hokkaido. When the great provincial armies were gradually disbanded under Hideyoshi and Ieyasu, many out-of-work samurai roamed the country redundant in an era of peace. Musashi was one such samurai, a Renin wave man. There were still samurai retainers to the Tokugawas and provincial lords, but their numbers were few. The hordes of redundant samurai found themselves living in a society which was completely based on the old chivalry, but at the same time they were apart from a society in which there was no place for men at arms. They became an inverted class, keeping the old chivalry alive by devotion to military arts, with the fervor only Japanese possess. This was the time of the flowering in Kendo. Kendo, the way of the sword, had always been synonymous with nobility in Japan. Since the founding of the samurai class in the 8th century, the military arts had become the highest form of study, inspired by the teachings of Zen and the feeling of Shinto. Schools of Kendo born in the early Muromachi period, approximately 1390 to 1600, were continued through the upheavals of the formation of the peaceful Tokugawa shogunate and survive to this day. The education of the sons of the Tokugawa shoguns was by means of schooling in the Chinese classics and fencing exercises. Where a Westerner might say the pen is mightier than the sword, the Japanese would say bunbuichi, or pen and sword in accord. Today, prominent businessmen and political figures in Japan still practice the old traditions of Kendo schools, preserving the forms of several hundred years ago. To sum up, Musashi was a Renin at a time when the samurai were formally considered to be the elite, but actually had no means of livelihood unless they owned lands and castles. Many Renin put up their swords and became artisans, but others, like Musashi, pursued the ideal of the warrior searching for enlightenment through the peril. Kendo traditionally, the fencing halls of Japan, called dojo, were associated with shrines and temples, but during Musashi's lifetime numerous schools sprang up in the new castle towns. Each daimyo or lord sponsored a Kendo school, where his retainers could be trained and his sons educated. The hope of every Renin was that he would defeat the students and master of a dojo in combat, thus increasing his fame and bringing his name to the ears of one who might employ him. The samurai wore two swords thrust through the belt with the cutting edge uppermost. The longer sword was carried out of doors only, the shorter sword was worn at all times. For training, wooden swords and bamboo swords were often used. Dueling and other tests of arms were common, with both real and practice swords. These took place in fencing halls and before shrines, in the streets, and within castle walls. Duels were fought to the death, or until one of the contestants was disabled, but a few generations after Musashi's time the shinai, a pliable bamboo sword, and later padded fencing armor, came to be widely used, so the chances of injury were greatly reduced. The samurai studied with all kinds of weapons, halberds, sticks, swords, chain and sickle, and others. Many schools using such weapons survive in traditional form in Japan today. To train in Kendo, one must subjugate the self, bear the pain of grueling practice, and cultivate a level mind in the face of peril. But the way of the sword means not only fencing training, but also living by the code of honor of the samurai elite. Warfare was the spirit of the samurai's everyday life, and he could face death as if it were a domestic routine. The meaning of life and death by the sword was mirrored in the everyday conduct of the feudal Japanese, and he who realized the resolute acceptance of death at any moment in his everyday life was a master of the sword. It is in order to attain such an understanding that Kendo and Zen, the way of the sword, is the moral teaching of the samurai, fostered by the Confucianist philosophy which shaped the Tokugawa system, together with the native Shinto religion of Japan. The warrior courts of Japan from the Kamakura period to the Muromachi period encouraged the austere Zen study among the samurai, and Zen went hand in hand with the arts of war. In Zen there are no elaborations, it aims directly at the true nature of things. There are no ceremonies, no teachings, the prize of Zen is essentially personal. Enlightenment in Zen does not mean a change in behavior, but realization of the nature of ordinary life. The end point is the beginning, and the great virtue is simplicity. The secret teaching of the Ito Ryu school of Kendo, Karaitashi, is the first technique of some hundred or so. The teaching is Iuchi, meaning to cut the opponent just as he cuts you. This is the ultimate timing. It is lack of anger. It means to treat your enemy as an honored guest. It also means to abandon your life or throw away fear. The first technique is the last, the beginner and the master behave in the same way. Knowledge is a full circle. The first of Musashi's chapter headings is ground, for the basis of Kendo and Zen, and the last book is void, for that understanding which can only be expressed as nothingness. The teachings of Kendo are like the fierce verbal forays to which the Zen student is subjected. Assailed with doubts and misery, his mind and spirit in a whirl, the student is gradually guided to realization and understanding by his teacher. The kendo student practices furiously, thousands of cuts morning and night, learning fierce techniques of horrible war, until eventually sword becomes no sword, intention becomes no intention, a spontaneous knowledge of every situation. The first elementary teaching concerning the life of Miyamoto Musashi. Shinman Musashi no Kami Fujiwara no Genshin, or as he is commonly known Miyamoto Musashi, was born in the village called Miyamoto, in the province Mimasaka in 1584. Musashi is the name of an area southwest of Tokyo, and the appellation no Kami means noble person of the area, while Fujiwara is the name of the noble family foremost in Japan over 1,000 years ago. Musashi's ancestors were a branch of the powerful Harima clan in Kyushu, the southern island of Japan. Harada Shokan, his grandfather, was a retainer of Shinman Iga no Kami Tsudashige, the lord of Takeyama Castle. Harada Shokan was highly thought of by his lord and eventually married his lord's daughter. When Musashi was 7, his father, Munasai, either died or abandoned the child. As his mother had died, Ben no Suke, as Musashi was known during his childhood, was left in the care of an uncle on his mother's side, a priest. So we find Musashi an orphan during Hideyoshi's campaigns of unification, son of a samurai in a violent unhappy land. He was a boisterous youth, strong-willed and physically large for his age. Whether he was urged to pursue kendo by his uncle or whether his aggressive nature led him to it, we do not know, but it is recorded that he slew a man in single combat when he was just 13. The opponent was Arima Kihei, a samurai of the Shinto Ryu school of military arts, skilled with sword and spear. The boy threw the man to the ground and beat him about the head with a stick when he tried to rise. Kihei died vomiting blood. Musashi's next contest was when he was 16, when he defeated Tadashima Akiyama. About this time, he left home to embark on the warrior pilgrimage, which saw him victor in scores of contests and which took him to war 6 times until he finally settled down at the age of 50, having reached the end of his search for reason. There must have been many Renin traveling the country on similar expeditions, some alone like Musashi and some enjoying sponsorship, though not on the scale of the pilgrimage of the famous swordsman Tsukahara Bakuden, who had traveled with a retinue of over 100 men in the previous century. This part of Musashi's life was spent living apart from society, while he devoted himself with a ferocious single-mindedness to the search for enlightenment by the way of the sword. Concerned only with perfecting his skill, he lived as men need not live, wandering over Japan soaked by the cold winds of winter, not dressing his hair, not taking a wife, nor following any profession save his study. It is said he never entered a bathtub lest he was caught unawares without a weapon, and that his appearance was uncouth and wretched. In the battle which resulted in Ieyasu succeeding Hideyoshi as shogun of Japan, Sekigahara, Musashi joined the ranks of the Ashikaga army to fight against Ieyasu. He survived the terrible 3 days during which 70,000 people died, and also survived the hunting down and massacre of the vanquished army. He went up to Kyoto, the capital, when he was 21. This was the scene of his vendetta against the Yoshioka family. The Yoshiokas had been fencing instructors to the Ashikaga house for generations. Later forbidden to teach kendo by Lord Tokugawa, the family became dyers and are dyers today. Munasai, Musashi's father, had been invited to Kyoto some years before by the shogun Ashikaga Yoshioka. Munasai was a competent swordsman and an expert with the jit, a kind of iron truncheon with a tongue for catching sword blades. The story has it that Munasai fought 3 of the Yoshiokas, winning 2 of the duels, and perhaps this has some bearing on Musashi's behavior towards the family. Yoshioka Sujiro, the head of the family, was the first to fight Musashi on the moor outside the city. Sujiro was armed with a real sword. Musashi lingered on in the capital, and his continued presence further irked the Yoshiokas. The second brother, Denshichiro, applied to Musashi for a duel. As a military ploy, Musashi arrived late on the appointed day, and seconds after the start of the fight, he broke his opponent's skull with one blow of his wooden sword. Denshichiro was dead. The house issued yet another challenge with Henshichiro, the young son of Sujiro, as champion. Henshichiro was a mere boy, not yet in his teens. The contest was to be held by a pine tree adjacent to rice fields. Musashi arrived at the meeting place well before the appointed time and waited in hiding for his enemy to come. The child arrived dressed formally in war gear, with a party of well-armed retainers, determined to do away with Musashi. Musashi waited concealed in the shadows, and just as they were thinking that he had thought better of it and had decided to leave Kyoto, he suddenly appeared in the midst of them and cut the boy down. Then, drawing both swords, he cut a path through them and made his escape. After that frightful episode, Musashi wandered over Japan, becoming a legend in his own time. We find mention of his name and stories of his prowess in registers, diaries, on monuments, and in folk memory from Tokyo to Kyushu. He had more than 60 contests before he was 29 and won them all. The earliest account of his contests appears in Night and Kai, or Two Heavens Chronicle, a record compiled by his pupils a generation after his death. In the year of the Yoshioka affair, 1605, he visited the temple Hosoin in the south of the capital. Here he had a contest with Oku Hosoin, the Nichiren sect pupil of the Zen priest Hoinen. The priest was a spearman, but no match for Musashi, who defeated him twice with his short wooden sword. Musashi stayed at the temple for some time studying fighting techniques and enjoying talks with the priests. There is still today a traditional spear fighting form practiced by the monks of Hosoin. It is interesting that in ancient times the word asho, which now means priest, used to mean spear teacher. Hoinen was pupil to Izumi Musashi no Kami, a master of Shinto kendo. The priest used spears with cross-shaped blades kept outside the temple under the eaves and used in firefighting. When Musashi was in Iga province, he met a skilled chain and sickle fighter named Shishido Bacon. As Shishido twirled his chain, Musashi drew a dagger and pierced his breast, advancing to finish him off. The watching pupils attacked Musashi, but he frightened them away in 4 directions. In Edo, a fighter named Muzo Ganasuke visited Musashi requesting a duel. Musashi was cutting wood to make a bow, and granting Ganasuke's request stood up intending to use the slender wand he was cutting as a sword. Ganasuke made a fierce attack, but Musashi stepped straight in and banged him on the head. Ganasuke went away. Passing through Izumo province, Musashi visited Lord Matsudaira and asked permission to fight with his strongest expert. There were many good strategists in Izumo. Permission was granted against a man who used an 8-foot-long hexagonal wooden pole. The contest was held in the Lord's library garden. Musashi used 2 wooden swords. He chased the samurai up the 2 wooden steps of the library veranda, thrust at his face on the 2nd step, and hit him on both his arms as he flinched away. To the surprise of the assembled retainers, Lord Matsudaira asked Musashi to fight him. Musashi drove the lord up the library steps as before, and when he tried to make a resolute fencing attitude, Musashi hit his sword with the fire and stones cut, breaking it in 2. The lord bowed in defeat, and Musashi stayed for some time as his teacher. Musashi's most well-known duel was in the 17th year of Kaicho, 1612, when he was in Agura in Bunzen province. His opponent was Sasaki Kajiro. Kajiro, through the offices of one of the Hosokawa retainers who had been a pupil of Musashi's father, one Nagaoka Sato Akanaga. Permission was granted for the contest to be held at 8 o'clock the next morning, and the place was to be an island some few miles from Agura. That night Musashi left his lodging and moved to the house of Kobayashi Teruzeman. This inspired a rumor that awe of Kajiro's subtle technique had made Musashi run away afraid for his life. The next day at 8 o'clock Musashi could not be woken until a prompter came from the officials assembled on the island. He got up, drank the water they brought to him to wash with, and went straight down to the shore. As Sato rowed across to the island, Musashi fashioned a paper string to tie back the sleeves of his kimono and cut a wooden sword from the spare oar. When he had done this he lay down to rest. The boat neared the place of combat, and Kajiro and the waiting officials were astounded to see the strange figure of Musashi, with his unkempt hair tied up in a towel, leap from the boat brandishing the long wooden oar and rush through the waves up the beach towards his enemy. Kajiro drew his long sword, a fine blade by Nagamitsu of bison, and threw away his scabbard. "You have no more need of that," said Musashi as he rushed forward with his sword held to one side. Kajiro was provoked into making the first cut, and Musashi dashed upward at his blade, bringing the oar down on Kajiro's head. As Kajiro fell, his sword, which had cut the towel from Musashi's head, cut across the hem of his divided skirt. Musashi noted Kajiro's condition and bowed to the astounded officials before running back to his boat. Some sources have it that after he killed Kajiro, Musashi threw down the oar and, nimbly leaping back several paces, drew both his swords and flourished them with a shout at his fallen enemy. It was about this time that Musashi stopped ever using real swords in duels. He was invincible, and from now on he devoted himself to the search for perfect understanding by way of kendo. In 1614 and again in 1615, he took the opportunity of once more experiencing warfare and siege. Ieyasu laid siege to Osaka Castle, where the supporters of the Ashikaga family were gathered in insurrection. Musashi joined the Tokugawa forces in both winter and summer campaigns, now fighting against those he had fought for as a youth at Sekigahara. According to his own writing, he came to understand strategy when he was 50 or 51 in 1634. He and his adopted son Lori, the waif whom he had met in Dewa province on his travels, settled in Agura in this year. Musashi was never again to leave Kyushu Island. The Hosokawa house had been entrusted with the command of the hot seat of Higo province, Kumamoto Castle, and the new lord of Bunzen was in Ogasawara. Lori found employment under Ogasawara Tadazane, and as a captain in Tadazane's army, fought against the Christians in the Shimawara uprising of 1638, when Iyasashi was about 55. The lords of the southern provinces had always been antagonistic to the Tokugawas and were the instigators of intrigue with foreign powers and the Japanese Christians. Musashi was a member of the field staff at Shimawara where the Christians were massacred. After this, Ieyasu closed the ports of Japan to foreign intercourse, and they remained closed for over 200 years. After 6 years in Agura, Musashi was invited to stay with Churl, the Hosokawa lord of Kumamoto Castle, as a guest. He stayed a few years with Lord Churi and spent his time teaching and painting. In 1643, he retired to a life of seclusion in a cave called Ryugendo. Here he wrote Go-Rin no Sho, addressed to his pupil Teruo Nobuyuki, a few weeks before his death on the 19th of May, 1645. Musashi is known to the Japanese as Kensei, that is sword saint. Go-Rin no Sho heads every kendo bibliography, being unique among books of martial art in that it deals with both the strategy of warfare and the methods of single combat in exactly the same way. The book is not a thesis on strategy, it is in Musashi's words, a guide for men who want to learn strategy and, as a guide always leads, so the contents are always beyond the student's understanding. The more one reads the book the more one finds in its pages. It is Musashi's last will, the key to the path he trod. When, at 28 or 29, he had become such a strong fighter, he did not settle down and build a school, replete with success, but became doubly engrossed with his study. In his, Musashi wrote, "When you have attained the way of strategy there will be not one thing that you cannot understand, and you will see the way in everything." He did, in fact, become a master of arts and crafts. He produced masterpieces of ink painting, probably more highly valued by the Japanese than the ink paintings of any other. His works include cormorants, herons, Hotel the Shinto god, dragons, birds with flowers, bird in a dead tree, Daruma, Bodhidharma, and others. He was a fine calligrapher, evidenced by his piece Senki, Warsport. There is a small wood sculpture of the Buddhist deity Fudo Mayu in private hands. A sculpture of Kwanon was lost recently. He made works in metal and founded the school of sword guard makers who signed Niton after him, see below. He is said to have written poems and songs, but none of these survive. It is said also that he was commissioned by the shogun Iemitsu to paint the sunrise over Edo Castle. His paintings are sometimes impressed with his seal, Musashi, or his nom de plume Niton. Niton means two heavens, said by some to allude to his fighting attitude with a sword in each hand held above his head. In some places he established schools known as Niton Ryu, and in other places called it, and Me Ryu, clear circle. He wrote study the ways of all professions. It is evident that he did just that. He sought out not only great swordsmen but also priests, strategists, artists and craftsmen, eager to broaden his knowledge. Musashi writes about the various aspects of kendo in such a way that it is possible for the beginner to study at beginner's level and for kendo masters to study the same words on a higher level. This applies not just to military strategy, but to any situation where plans and tactics are used. Japanese businessmen have used Go-Rin no Slio as a guide for business practice, making sales campaigns like military operations, using the same energetic methods. In the same way that Musashi seems to have been a horribly cruel man, yet was following logically an honest ideal, so successful business seems to most people to be without conscience. Musashi's life study is thus as relevant in the 20th century as it was on the medieval battleground and applies not just to the Japanese race, but to all nations. I suppose you could sum up his inspiration as humility and hard work. Introduction. I have been many years training in the way of strategy called Naiten Ichiryu, and now I think I will explain it in writing for the first time. It is now during the first 10 days of the 10th month in the 20th year of Kane, 1645. I have climbed Mountain Iwato of Higo in Kyushu to pay homage to heaven, pray to Kwanon and kneel before Buddha. I am a warrior of Harima province, Shinman Musashi no Kami Fujiwara no Jeshin, age 60 years. From youth my heart has been inclined toward the way of strategy. My first duel was when I was 13, I struck down a strategist of the Shinto school, one Arima Kahei. When I was 16 I struck down an able strategist, Tadashima Akiyama. When I was 21 I went up to the capital and met all manner of strategists, never once failing to win in many contests. After that I went from province to province dueling with strategists of various schools and not once failed to win, even though I had as many as 60 encounters. This was between the ages of 13 and 28 or 29. When I reached 30 I looked back on my past. The previous victories were not due to my having mastered strategy. Perhaps it was natural ability, or the order of heaven, or that other school's strategy was inferior. After that I studied morning and evening searching for the principle and came to realize the way of strategy when I was 50. Since then I have lived without following any particular way. Thus with the virtue of strategy I practice many arts and abilities, all things with no teacher. To write this book I did not use the law of Buddha or the teachings of Confucius, neither old war chronicles nor books on martial tactics. I take up my brush to explain the true spirit of this Ichi school 1 liter per liter A. The character for Wei is read Michi in Japanese or Du in Chinese based reading. It is equivalent to the Chinese Tao and means the whole life of the warrior, his devotion to the sword, his place in the Confucius-colored bureaucracy of the Tokugawa system. It is the road of the cosmos, not just a set of ethics for the artist or priest to live by, but the divine footprints of God pointing the way. 2. Strategy. Hai-ho is a word of Chinese derivation meaning military strategy. Hai means soldier and ho means method or form. 3. Homage to heaven. Ten or heaven means the Shinto religion, Shinto a word compounding the 2 characters, kami, God, and michi, Wei is the old religion of Japan. In Shinto there are many holies, gods of steel and fermentation, place and industry, and so on, and the first gods, ancestors to the imperial line. Kwanan. God des, of mercy in Buddhism. Arima Kahei. Of the Shinto school. See note 15. All things with no teacher. There had been traditions instituted for the arts in the Muromachi period, system of grades and licenses and seniority, and these were perpetuated perhaps more rigidly under the Tokugawa bureaucracy. Musashi studied various arts in various schools, but when after his enlightenment he pursued his studies he had become separate from traditional guidance. He writes his final words in the Book of the Void. Then you will come to think of things in a wide sense, and taking the void as the way, you will see the way as void. Spirit Shin or Kokoro has been translated heart, soul, or spirit. It could be put as feeling, manner. It has always been said, the sword is the soul of the samurai. As it is mirrored in the way of heaven and Kwanan. The time is the night of the 10th day of the 10th month, at the hour of the tiger, 3 to 5 a.m., the hour of the figure. Years, months and hours were named after the ancient Chinese zodiacal time system. The ground book strategy is the craft of the warrior. Commanders must enact the craft, and troopers should know this way. There is no warrior in the world today who really understands the way of strategy. There are various ways. There is the way of salvation by the law of Buddha, the way of Confucius governing the way of learning, the way of healing as a doctor, as a poet, teaching the way of Waka T degrees archery, and many arts and skills. Each man practices as he feels inclined. 5. Waka. The 31-syllable poem. The word means song of Japan or song in harmony. Tea drinking is studied in schools, just like sword fencing. It is basically a ritual, based on simple refined rules, between a few persons in a small room. 1. Archery. The bow was the main weapon of the samurai of the Nara and Heian periods, and was later superseded by the sword. Archery is practiced as a ritual like tea and sword. Hachiman, the god of war, is often depicted as an archer, and the bow is frequently illustrated as part of the paraphernalia of the gods. 12. Pen and sword. Bunbu ichi or pen and sword in accord is often presented in brushed calligraphy. Young men during the Tokugawa period were educated solely in writing the Chinese classics and exercising in swordplay. Pen and sword, in fact, filled the life of the Japanese nobility. 13. Resolute acceptance of death. This idea can be summed up as the philosophy expounded in Hagakure or Hidden Leaves, a book written in the 17th century by Yamamoto Tsunenori and a few other samurai of the province Nabeshima Han, present-day Saga. Under the Tokugawas, the enforced logic of the Confucius-influenced system ensured stability among the samurai, but it also meant the passing of certain aspects of Bushido. Discipline for both samurai and commoners became lax. Yamamoto Tsunenori had been counselor to Mitsushige, lord of Nabeshima Han, for many years, and upon his lord's death, he wanted to commit suicide with his family in the traditional manner. This kind of suicide was strictly prohibited by the new legislation, and, full of remorse, Yamamoto retired in sadness to the boundary of Nabeshima Han. Here he met others who had faced the same predicament, and together they wrote a lament of what they saw as the decadence of Bushido. Their criticism is a revealing comment on the changing face of Japan during Musashi's lifetime. There is no way to describe what a warrior should do other than he should adhere to the way of the warrior, Bushido. I find that all men are negligent of this. There are a few men who can quickly reply to the question, what is the way of the warrior? This is because they do not know in their hearts. From this we can say they do not follow the way of the warrior. By the way of the warrior is meant death. The way of the warrior is death. This means choosing death whenever there is a choice between life and death. It means nothing more than this. It means to see things through, being resolved. Sayings like to die with your intention unrealized is to die uselessly, and so on, are from the weak Kyoto, Osaka Bushido. They are unresolved as to whether to keep to their original plan when faced with the choice of life and death. Every man wants to live. They theorize with staying alive in mind. The man who lives on when he had failed in his intention is a coward is a heartless definition. That to die having failed is to die uselessly is a mad point of view. This is not a shameful thing. It is the most important thing in the way of the warrior. If you keep your spirit correct from morning to night, accustomed to the idea of death and resolved on death, and consider yourself as a dead body, thus becoming one with the way of the warrior, you can pass through life with no possibility of failure, and lowlier folk have been known to die readily in the cause of duty or out of shame. This is a different thing. The warrior is different in that studying the way of strategy is based on overcoming men. By victory gained in crossing swords with individuals or in joining battle with large numbers, we can attain power and fame for ourselves or for our Lord. This is the virtue of strategy. The way of strategy in China and Japan, practitioners of the way have been known as masters of strategy. Warriors must learn this way. Recently there have been people getting on in the world as strategists, but they are usually just sword fencers. The attendants of the Kashima Kantori shrines of the province Hitachi received instruction from the gods and made schools based on this teaching, traveling from country to country instructing men. This is the recent meaning of strategy. In olden times, strategy was listed among the 10 abilities and 7 arts as a beneficial practice. It was certainly an art, but as beneficial practice it was not limited to sword fencing. The true value of sword fencing cannot be seen within the confines of sword fencing technique. Seen within the confines of sword fencing technique. Seen within the confines of sword fencing technique. Seen within the constantly. If we look at the world we see arts for sale. Men use equipment to sell their own selves. As if with the nut and the flower, the nut has become less than the flower. In this kind of way of strategy, both those teaching and those learning the way are concerned with coloring and showing off their technique, trying to hasten the bloom of the flower. They speak of this dojo and that dojo. They are looking for profit. Someone once said immature strategy is the cause of grief. That was a true saying. Perform your office properly. The servant must think earnestly of the business of his employer. Such a fellow is a splendid retainer. In this house there have been generations of splendid gentlemen, and we are deeply impressed by their warm kindness, all our ancestors. This was simply abandoning body and soul for the sake of their Lord. Moreover, our house excels in wisdom and technical skill. What a joyful thing if this can be used to advantage. Even an unadaptable man who is completely useless is a most trusted retainer if he does nothing more than think earnestly of his Lord's welfare. To think only of the practical benefit of wisdom and technology is vulgar. Some men are prone to having sudden inspirations. Some men do not quickly have good ideas, but arrive at the answer by slow consideration. Well, if we investigate the heart of the matter, even though people's natural abilities differ, bearing in mind the 4 oaths, when your thinking rises above concern for your own welfare, wisdom which is independent of thought appears. Whoever thinks deeply on things, even though he may carefully consider the future, will usually think around the basis of his own welfare. By the result of such evil thinking he will only perform evil acts. It is very difficult for most silly fellows to rise above thinking of their own welfare. So when you embark upon something, before you start, fix your intention on the 4 oaths and put selfishness behind you. Then you cannot fail. The 4 oaths. Never be late with respect to the way of the warrior. Be useful to the Lord. Be respectful to your parents. Get beyond love and grief. Exist for the good of man. Our Lord. This refers to the daimyo, who retained numbers of samurai to fight for them, see previous note. 5 Kashima Kantori spherines. The original schools of kendo can be found in the traditions preserved in Shinto shrines. Many of the school ancestors are entombed in the Kanto area, not far from Tokyo, where the Kashima and Kantori shrines still stand. Arima Kihei, the samurai whom Musashi killed at the age of 13, was a fencer of the Shinto school associated with the shrines. The Yaju school was derived from the Kashima style. Shinto was a religion of industry in everyday life, and the war gods enshrined at Kashima and Kantori are still invoked today as part of the everyday practice of the Shinto school. 15. Dojo. Dojo means way place, the room where something is studied. There are 4 ways in which men pass through life. As gentlemen, farmers, artisans and merchants. The way of the farmer. Using agricultural instruments, he sees springs through to autumns with an eye on the changes of season. Second is the way of the merchant. The winemaker obtains his ingredients and puts them to use to make his living. The way of the merchant is always to live by taking profit. This is the way of the merchant. Thirdly, the gentleman warrior, carrying the weaponry of his way. The way of the warrior is to master the virtue of his weapons. If a gentleman dislikes strategy, he will not appreciate the benefit of weaponry, so must he not have a little taste for this? Fourthly, the way of the artisan. The way of the carpenter is to become proficient in the use of his tools, first to lay his plans with a true measure, and then perform his work according to plan. Thus he passes through life. These are the 4 ways of the gentleman, the farmer, the artisan and the merchant. Comparing the way of the carpenter to strategy, the comparison with carpentry is through the connection with houses. Houses of the nobility, houses of warriors, the 4 houses, ruin of houses, thriving of houses, the style of the house, the tradition of the house, and the name of the house. The carpenter uses a master plan of the building, and the way of strategy is similar in that there is a plan of campaign. If you want to learn the craft of war, ponder over this book. The teacher is as a needle, the disciple is as thread. The foreman carpenter must know the architectural theory of towers and temples and the plans of palaces and must employ men to raise up houses. The way of the foreman carpenter is the same as the way of the commander of a warrior house. In the construction of houses, choice of woods is made. Straight unknotted timber of good appearance is used for the revealed pillars, straight timber with small defects is used for the inner pillars. Timber of the finest appearance, even if a little weak, is used for the thresholds, lintels, doors, and sliding doors and so on. Good strong timber, though it be gnarled and knotted, can always be used discreetly in construction. Timber which is weak or knotted throughout should be used as scaffolding and later for firewood. The foreman carpenter allots his men work according to their ability. Floor layers, makers of sliding doors, thresholds and lintels, ceilings and so on. Those of poor ability lay the floor joist, and those of lesser ability carve wedges and do such miscellaneous work. If the foreman knows and deploys his men well, the finished work will be good. The foreman should take into account the abilities and limitations of his men, circulating among them and asking nothing unreasonable. He should know their morale and spirit and encourage them when necessary. This is the same as the principle of 4 ways. See translator's introduction for an explanation of the 4 classes in Japanese society. 1. Carpenter. All buildings in Japan, except for the walls of the great castles which appeared a few generations before Musashi's birth, were wooden. Carpenter means architect and builder. 13. 4 houses. There were 4 branches of the Fujiwara family who dominated Japan in the Heian period. There are also 4 different schools of tea. 2. Warrior house. The warrior families who had been in control of Japan for most of her history kept private armies, each with its own commander. 21. Sliding doors. Japanese buildings made liberal use of sliding doors, detachable walls, and shutters made of wood, which were put over door openings at night and in bad weather. Strategy. The way of strategy. Like a trooper, the carpenter sharpens his own tools. He carries his equipment in his toolbox and works under the direction of his foreman. He makes columns and girders with an axe, shapes floorboards and shelves with a plane, cuts fine openwork and carvings accurately, giving as excellent a finish as his skill will allow. This is the craft of carpenters. When the carpenter becomes skilled and understands measures, he can become a foreman. The carpenter's attainment is having tools which will cut well to make small shrines, writing shelves, tables, paper lanterns, chopping boards and pot lids. These are the specialities of the carpenter. Things are similar for the trooper. You ought to think deeply about this. The attainment of the carpenter is that his work is not warped, that the joints are not misaligned, and that the work is truly planed so that it meets well and is not merely finished in sections. This is essential. If you want to learn this way, deeply consider the things written in this book one at a time. You must do sufficient research. Outline of the 5 books of this book of strategy. The way is shown in 5 books concerning different aspects. These are ground, water, fire, tradition, wind, and void. The body of the way of strategy from the viewpoint of Maiichi school is explained in the ground book. It is difficult to realize the true way just through sword fencing. Know the smallest things and the biggest things, the shallowest things and the deepest things. as if it were a straight road mapped out on the ground. The first book is called the ground book. Second is the water book. With water as the basis, the spirit becomes like water. Water adopts the shape of its receptacle. It is sometimes a trickle and sometimes a wild sea. Water has a clear blue color. By the clarity, things of Ichi school are shown in this book. If you master the principles of sword fencing, when you freely beat one man, you beat any man in the world. The spirit of defeating a man is the same for spear gives a little extra strength. Spear and halberd both have their uses, but neither is very beneficial in confined spaces. They cannot be used for taking a prisoner. They are essentially weapons for the field. Anyway, if you learn indoor techniques you will think narrowly and forget the true way. Thus you will have difficulty in actual encounters. The bow is tactically strong at the commencement of battle, especially battles on a moor, as it is possible to shoot quickly from among the spearmen. However, it is unsatisfactory in sieges or when the enemy is more than 40 yards away. For this reason there are nowadays few traditional schools of archery. There is little use nowadays for this kind of skill. From inside fortifications, the gun has no equal among weapons. It is the supreme weapon on the field before the ranks clash, but once swords are crossed the gun becomes useless. One of the virtues of the bow is that you can see the arrows in flight and correct your aim accordingly, whereas gunshot cannot be seen. You must appreciate the importance of this. Just as a horse must have endurance and no defects, so it is with weapons. Horses should walk strongly, and swords and companion swords should cut strongly. Spears and halberds must stand up to heavy use. Bows and guns must be sturdy. Weapons should be hardy rather than decorative. You should not have a favorite weapon. To become overfamiliar with one weapon is as much a fault as not knowing it sufficiently well. You should not copy others, but use weapons which you can handle properly. It is bad for commanders and troops to have likes and dislikes. These are things you must learn thoroughly. Timing and strategy. There is timing in everything. Timing and strategy cannot be mastered without a great deal of practice. Timing is important in dancing and pipe or string music, for they are in rhythm only if timing is good. Timing and rhythm are also involved in the military arts, shooting bows and guns, and riding horses. In all skills and abilities there is timing. There is also timing in the void. There is timing in the whole life of the warrior, in his thriving and declining, in his harmony and discord. Similarly, there is timing in the way of the merchant, in the rise and fall of capital. All things entail rising and falling timing. You must be able to discern this. In strategy there are various timing considerations. From the outset you must know the applicable timing and the inapplicable timing, and from among the large and small things, and the fast and slow timings find the relevant timing, first seeing the distance timing and 31 indoor techniques. Dojos were mostly where a great deal of formality and ritual was observed, safe from the prying eyes of rival schools. The background timing. This is the main thing in strategy. It is especially important to know the background timing, otherwise your strategy will become uncertain. You win in battles with the timing in the void born of the timing of cunning, by knowing the enemy's timing, and this using a timing which the enemy does not expect. All the 5 books are chiefly concerned with timing. You must train sufficiently to appreciate all this. If you practice day and night in the above Ichi school strategy, your spirit will naturally broaden. Thus is large-scale strategy and the strategy of hand-to-hand combat propagated in the world. This is recorded for the first time in the 5 books of ground, water, fire, tradition, wind, and void. This is the way for men who want to learn my strategy. Do not think dishonestly. The way is in training. Become acquainted with every art. Know the ways of all professions. Distinguish between gain and loss in worldly matters. Develop intuitive judgment and understanding for everything. Perceive those things which cannot be seen. Pay attention even to trifles. Do nothing which is of no use. It is important to start by setting these broad principles in your heart and train in the way of strategy. Moreover, in large-scale strategy the superior man will manage many subordinates dexterously, bear himself correctly, govern the country and foster the people, thus preserving the ruler's discipline. If there is a way involving the spirit of not being defeated, to help oneself and gain honor, it is the way of strategy. The 2nd year of Shoho, 1645, the 5th month, the 12th day. Teruo Maganoho Shinmin Musashi Teruo Maganoho. The pupil, sometimes called Teruo Nabayuki, to whom Musashi addressed Gorin no Sho. The water book The Spirit of the Night Tenichi School of Strategy is based on water, and this water book explains methods of victory as the long sword form of the Ichi school. Language does not extend to explaining the way in detail, but it can be grasped intuitively. Study this book, read a word then ponder on it. If you interpret the meaning loosely you will mistake the way. The principles of strategy are written down here in terms of single combat, but you must think broadly so that you attain an understanding for 10,000 aside battles. Strategy is different from other things in that if you mistake the way even a little you will become bewildered and fall into bad ways. If you merely read this book you will not reach the way of strategy. Absorb the things written in this book. Do not just read, memorize or imitate, but so that you realize the principle from within your own heart. Study hard to absorb these things into your body. Spiritual bearing in strategy. In strategy your spiritual bearing must not be any different from normal. Both in fighting and in everyday life you should be determined though calm. Meet the situation without tenseness yet not recklessly, your spirit settled yet unbiased. Even when your spirit is calm do not let your body relax, and when your body is relaxed do not let your spirit slacken. Do not let your spirit be influenced by your body, or your body influenced by your spirit. Be neither insufficiently spirited nor over-spirited. An elevated spirit is weak and a low spirit is weak. Do not let the enemy see your spirit. Small people must be completely familiar with the spirit of large people, and large people must be familiar with the spirit of small people. Whatever your size, do not be misled by the reactions of your own body. With your spirit open and unconstricted, look at things from a high point of view. You must cultivate your wisdom and spirit. Polish your wisdom. Learn public justice, distinguish between good and evil, study the ways of different arts one by one. When you cannot be deceived by men you will have realized the wisdom of strategy. The wisdom of strategy is different from other things. On the battlefield, even when you are hard-pressed, you should ceaselessly research the principles of strategy so that you can develop a steady spirit. Stance and strategy. Adopt a stance with the head erect, neither hanging down, nor looking up, nor twisted. Your forehead and the space between your eyes should not be wrinkled. Do not roll your eyes nor allow them to blink, but slightly narrow them. With your features compassed, keep the line of your nose straight with a feeling of slightly flaring your nostrils. Hold the line of the rear of the neck straight. Instill vigor into your hairline, and in the same way from the shoulders down through your entire body. Lower both shoulders and, without the buttocks jutting out, put strength into your legs from the knees to the tops of your toes. Brace your abdomen so that you do not bend at the hips. Wed your companion sword and your belt against your abdomen so that your belt is not slack. This is called wedging in. In all forms of strategy, it is necessary to maintain the combat stance in everyday life and to make your everyday stance your combat stance. You must research this well. The gaze in strategy. The gaze should be large and broad. This is the twofold gaze: perception and sight. Perception is strong and sight weak. In strategy it is important to see distant things as if they were close and to take a distanced view of close things. It is important in strategy to know the enemy's sword and not to be distracted by insignificant movements of his sword. You must study this. The gaze is the same for single combat and for large-scale combat. It is necessary in strategy to be able to look to both sides without moving the eyeballs. You cannot master this ability quickly. Learn what is written here. Use this gaze in everyday life and do not vary it whatever happens. Holding the long sword. It whatever happens. Holding the long sword. It whatever happens. Grip the long sword with a rather floating feeling in your thumb and forefinger, with the middle finger neither tight nor slack, and with the last two fingers tight. It is bad to have play in your hands. When you take up a sword, you must feel intent on cutting the enemy. As you cut an enemy you must not change your grip, and your hands must not cower. When you dash the enemy's sword aside, or ward it off, or force it down, you must slightly change the feeling in your thumb and forefinger. Above all, you must be intent on cutting the enemy in the way you grip the sword. The grip for combat and for sword testing is the same. There is no such thing as a man-cutting grip. Generally, I dislike fixedness in both long swords and hands. Fixedness means a dead hand. Pliability is a living hand. You must bear this in mind. Footwork with the tips of your toes somewhat floating, tread firmly with your heels. Whether you move fast or slow, with large or small steps, your feet must always move as in normal 33 sword testing. Swords were tested by highly specialized professional testers. The sword would be fitted into a special mounting and test cuts made on bodies, bundles of straw, armor, sheets of metal, etc. Sometimes, appraisal marks of a sword testing inscribed on the tangs of old blades are found. 3. Footwork. Different methods of moving are used in different schools. Yin-yang, or in-yo in Japanese, is female-male, dark-light, right-left. Musashi advocates this level-mind kind of walking, although he is emphatic about the significance of these parameters. Issues of right and left foot arise in the Win Book of Gorin no Sho. Old jiu-jitsu schools advocate making the first attack with the left side forward. Walking. I dislike the three walking methods known as jumping foot, floating foot and fixed steps. So-called yin-yang foot is important to the way. Yin-yang foot means not moving only one foot. It means moving your feet left-right and right-left when cutting, withdrawing, or warding off a cut. You should not move one foot preferentially. The five attitudes are upper, middle, lower, right side, and left side. These are the five. Although attitude has these five dimensions, the one purpose of all of them is to cut the enemy. There are none but these five attitudes. Whatever attitude you are in, do not be conscious of making the attitude, think only of cutting. Your attitude should be large or small according to the situation. Upper, lower and middle attitudes are decisive. Left side and right side attitudes are fluid. Left and right attitudes should be used if there is an obstruction overhead or to one side. The decision to use left or right depends on the place. The essence of the way is this. To understand attitude, you must thoroughly understand the middle attitude. The middle attitude is the heart of the attitudes. If we look at strategy on a broad scale, the middle attitude is the seat of the commander, with the other four attitudes following the commander. You must appreciate this. The way of the long sword. Knowing the way of the long sword means we can wield with two fingers the sword that we usually carry. If we know the path of the sword well, we can wield it easily. If you try to wield the long sword quickly, you will mistake the way. To wield the long sword well, you must wield it calmly. If you try to wield it quickly, like a folding fan or a short sword, you will err by using short sword chopping. You cannot cut a man with a long sword using this method. When you have cut downwards with the long sword, lift it straight upwards. When you cut sideways, return the sword along a sideways path. Return the sword in a reasonable way, always stretching the elbows broadly. Wield the sword strongly. This is the way of the long sword. If you learn to use the five approaches of my strategy, you will be able to wield a sword well. You must train constantly. The five approaches. The first approach is the middle attitude. Confront the enemy with the point of your sword against his face. When he attacks, dash his sword to the right and right it. 35. The way of the long sword. The way is a way of life and is the natural path of a sword blade. There is a natural 37. The five approaches. Who can understand Musashi's methods? It is necessary to study traditional schools and basic cutting practice. Bear in mind that fighting technique may start from a greater distance than it seems to at a first glance. It is said that the man who has faced death at the point of a sword has an elevated understanding. Or, when the enemy attacks, deflect the point of his sword by hitting downwards, keep your long sword where it is, and as the enemy renews the attack, cut his arms from below. This is the first method. The five approaches are this kind of thing. You must train repeatedly using a long sword in order to learn them. When you master my way of the long sword, you will be able to control any attack the enemy makes. I assure you, there are no attitudes other than the five attitudes of the long sword of Nido. In the second approach with the long sword, from the upper attitude, cut the enemy just as he attacks. If the enemy evades the cut, keep your sword where it is and, scooping from below, cut him as he renews the attack. It is possible to repeat the cut from here. In this method there are various changes in timing and spirit. You will be able to understand this by training in the Ichi school. You will always win with the five long sword methods. You must train repeatedly. In the third approach, adopt the lower attitude, anticipating scooping up. When the enemy attacks, hit his hands from below. As you do so, he may try to hit your sword down. If this is the case, cut his upper arms horizontally with a feeling of crossing. This means that from the lower attitudes you hit the enemy at the instant that he attacks. You will encounter this method often, both as a beginner and in later strategy. You must train holding a long sword. In this fourth approach, adopt the left side attitude. As the enemy attacks, hit his hands from below. If as you hit his hands he attempts to dash down your sword, with the feeling of hitting his hands, parry the path of his long sword and cut across from above your shoulder. This is the way of the long sword. Through this method you win by parrying the line of the enemy's attack. You must study this. In the fifth approach, the sword is in the right side attitude. In accordance with the enemy's attack, cross your sword from below at the side to the upper attitude. Then cut straight from above. This method is essential for knowing the way of the long sword well. If you can use this method, you can freely wield a heavy long sword. I cannot describe in detail how to use these 5 approaches. You must become well acquainted with Mayan harmony with the long sword way, learn large-scale timing, understand the enemy's long sword, and become used to the 5 approaches from the outset. You will always win by using these 5 methods, with various timing considerations discerning the enemy's spirit. You must consider all this carefully. The attitude no attitude teaching attitude no attitude means that there is no need for what are known as long sword attitudes. Even so, attitudes exist as the 5 ways of holding the long sword. However you hold the sword, it must be in such a way that it is easy to cut the enemy well, in accordance with the situation, the place, and your relation to the enemy. From the upper attitude as your spirit lessens you can adopt the middle attitude, and from the middle attitude you can raise the sword a little in your technique and adopt the upper attitude. From the lower attitude you can raise the sword a little and adopt the middle attitudes as the occasion demands. According to the situation, if you turn your sword from either the left side or right side attitude towards the center, the middle or the lower attitude results. The principle of this is called existing attitude, non-existing attitude. The primary thing when you take a sword in your hands is your intention to cut the enemy, whatever the means. Whenever you parry, hit, spring, strike or touch the enemy's cutting sword, you must cut the enemy in the same movement. It is essential to attain this. If you think only of hitting, springing, striking or touching the enemy, you will not be able actually to cut him. More than anything, you must be thinking of carrying your movement through to cutting him. You must thoroughly research this. Attitude and strategy on a larger scale is called battle array. Such attitudes are all to hit the enemy in one timing. In one timing means, when you have closed with the enemy, to hit him as quickly and directly as possible, without moving your body or settling your spirit, while you see that he is still undecided. The timing of hitting before the enemy decides to withdraw, break or hit, is this in one timing. You must train to achieve this timing, to be able to hit in the timing of an instant. The abdomen timing of 2 when you attack and the enemy quickly retreats, as you see him tense, you must feign to cut. Then, as he relaxes, follow up and hit him. This is the abdomen timing of 2. It is very difficult to attain this merely by reading this book, but you will soon understand with a little instruction. No design, no conception in this method. When the enemy attacks and you decide to attack, hit with your body, and hit with your spirit, and hit from the void with your hands, accelerating strongly. This is the no design, no conception cut. This is the most important method of hitting. It is often used. You must train hard to understand it. The flowing water cut. The flowing water cut is used when you are struggling blade to blade with the enemy. When he breaks and quickly withdraws trying to spring with his long sword, expand your body and spirit and cut him as slowly as possible with your long sword, following your body like stagnant water. You can cut with certainty if you learn this. You must discern the enemy's grade. 38. No design, no conception. Munin muso. This means the ability to act calmly and naturally even in the face of danger. It is the highest accord with existence, when a man's word and his actions are spontaneously the same. Continuous cut when you attack and the enemy also attacks, and your swords spring together, in one action cut his head, hands and legs. When you cut several places with one sweep of the long sword, it is the continuous cut. You must practice this cut, it is often used. With detailed practice you should be able to understand it. The fire and stones cut. The fires and stones cut means that when the enemy's long sword and your long sword clash together, you cut as strongly as possible, without raising the sword even a little. This means cutting quickly with the hands, body and legs, all 3 cutting strongly. If you train well enough you will be able to strike strongly. The red leaves cut. The red leaves cut means knocking down the enemy's long sword. The spirit should be getting control of his sword. When the enemy is in a long sword attitude in front of you and intent on cutting, hitting and parrying, you strongly hit the enemy's sword with the fire and stones cut, perhaps in the design of the no design, no conception cut. If you then beat down the point of his sword with a sticky feeling, he will necessarily drop the sword. If you practice this cut it becomes easy to make the enemy drop his sword. You must train repetitively. The body in place of the long sword, also the long sword in place of the body. Usually we move the body and the sword at the same time to cut the enemy. However, according to the enemy's cutting method, you can dash against him with your body first and afterwards cut with the sword. If his body is immovable, you can cut first with the long sword, but generally you hit first with the body and then cut with the long sword. You must research this well and practice hitting. Cut and slash. To cut and slash are 2 different things. Cutting, whatever form of cutting it is decisive, with a resolute spirit. Slashing is nothing more than touching the enemy. Even if you slash strongly, and even if the enemy dies instantly, it is slashing. When you cut, your spirit is resolved. You must appreciate this. If you first slash the enemy's hands or legs, you must then cut strongly. Slashing is in spirit the same as touching. When you realize this, they become indistinguishable. Learn this well. Chinese monkey's body, red leaves cut. Presumably Musashi is alluding here to falling, dying leaves. The Chinese monkey's body is the spirit of not stretching out your arms. The spirit is to get in quickly, without in the least extending your arms, before the enemy cuts. If you are intent upon not stretching out your arms, you are effectively far away. The spirit is to go in with your whole body. When you come to within arm's reach, it becomes easy to move your body in. You must research this well. Glue and lacquer emulsion body. This well. Glue and lacquer emulsion body. This well. Glue and lacquer emulsion body. This well. Glue and lacquer emulsion. The spirit of glue and lacquer emulsion body is to stick to the enemy and not separate from him. When you approach the enemy, stick firmly with your head, body and legs. People tend to advance their head and legs quickly, but their body lags behind. You should stick firmly so that there is not the slightest gap between the enemy's body and your body. You must consider this carefully. To strive for height. By to strive for height is meant, when you close with the enemy, to strive with him for superior height without cringing. Stretch your legs, stretch your hips, and stretch your neck face to face with him. When you think you have won, and you are the higher, thrust in strongly. You must learn this. To apply stickiness when the enemy attacks and you also attack with the long sword, you should go in with a sticky feeling and fix your long sword against the enemy's as you receive his cut. The spirit of stickiness is not hitting very strongly, but hitting so that the long swords do not separate easily. It is best to approach as calmly as possible when hitting the enemy's long sword with stickiness. The difference between stickiness and entanglement is that stickiness is firm and entanglement is weak. You must appreciate this. The body strike. The body strike means to approach the enemy through a gap in his guard. The spirit is to strike him with your body. Turn your face a little aside and strike the enemy's breast with your left shoulder thrust out. Approach with the spirit of bouncing the enemy away, striking as strongly as possible in time with your breathing. If you achieve this method of closing with the enemy, you will be able to knock him 10 or 20 feet away. It is possible to strike the enemy until he is dead. Train well. 3 ways to parry his attack. There are 3 methods to parry a cut. First, by dashing the enemy's long sword to your right, as if thrusting at his eyes. Chinese monkey's body. A Chinese monkey here means a short-armed monkey. Glue and lacquer emulsion. The lacquer work, which takes its name from Japan, used to coat furniture and home utensils, architecture, weapons and armor. When he makes an attack. Or, to parry by thrusting the enemy's long sword towards his right eye, with the feeling of snipping his neck. Or, when you have a short long sword, without worrying about parrying the enemy's long sword, to close with him quickly, thrusting at his face with your left hand. These are the 3 ways of parrying. You must bear in mind that you can always clench your left hand and thrust at the enemy's face with your fist. For this it is necessary to train well. To stab at the face. To stab at the face means, when you are in confrontation with the enemy, that your spirit is intent on stabbing at his face, following the line of the blades with the point of your long sword. If you are intent on stabbing at his face and body will become readable. When the enemy becomes readable, there are various opportunities for winning. You must concentrate on this. When fighting and the enemy's body becomes as if readable, you can win quickly, so you ought not to forget to stab at the face. You must pursue the value of this technique through training. To stab at the heart. To stab at the heart means, when fighting and there are obstructions above or to the sides, and whenever it is difficult to cut, to thrust at the enemy. You must stab the enemy's breast without letting the point of your long sword waver, showing the enemy the ridge of the blade square on, and with the spirit of deflecting his long sword. The spirit of this principle is often useful when we become tired or for some reason our long sword will not cut. You must understand the application of this method. To scold. Tut. Scold means that, when the enemy tries to counter-cut as you attack, you counter-cut again from below as if thrusting at him, trying to hold him down. With very quick timing you cut, scolding the enemy. Thrust up, tut. And cut, tut. This timing is encountered time and time again in exchanges of blows. The way to scold tut is to time the cut simultaneously with raising your long sword, as if to thrust the enemy. You must learn this through repetitive practice. The smacking parry. By smacking parry is meant that when you clash swords with the enemy, you meet his attacking cut on your long sword with a T-dum rhythm, smacking his sword and cutting him. Smacking the enemy's long sword in accordance with his attacking cut, primarily intent on quickly cutting him. If you understand the timing of smacking, however hard your long swords clash together, your sword point will not be knocked back even a little. You must research sufficiently to realize this. There are many enemies applies when you are fighting one against many. Draw both sword and companion sword and assume a wide-stretched left and right attitude. The spirit is to chase the enemies around from side to side, even though they come from all four directions. Observe their attacking order and go to meet first those who attack first. Sweep your eyes around broadly, carefully examining the attacking order, and cut left and right alternately with your swords. Waiting is bad. Always quickly reassume your attitudes to both sides, cut the enemies down as they advance, crushing them in the direction from which they attack. Whatever you do, you must drive the enemy together, as if tying a line of fishes, and when they are seen to be piled up, cut them down strongly, without giving them room to move. The advantage when coming to blows, you can know how to win through strategy with the long sword, but it cannot be clearly explained in writing. You must practice diligently in order to understand how to win. Oral tradition. The true way of strategy is revealed in the long sword. One cut you can win with certainty with the spirit of one cut. It is difficult to attain this if you do not learn strategy well. If you train well in this way, strategy will come from your heart and you will be able to win at will. You must train diligently. Direct communication. The spirit of direct communication is how the true way of the Nido Ichi school is received and handed down. Oral tradition. Teach your body strategy. Recorded in the above book is an outline of Ichi school sword fighting. To learn how to win with the long sword and strategy, first learn the 5 approaches and the 5 attitudes and absorb the way of the long sword naturally in your body. You must understand spirit and timing, handle the long sword naturally, and move body and legs in harmony with your spirit. Whether beating one man or two, you will then know values in strategy. Study the contents of this book, taking one item at a time, and through fighting with enemies, you will gradually come to know the principle of the way. There are many enemies. Musashi is held to be the inventor of the two-sword style. His school is sometimes called Nido Ryu, two-sword school, and sometimes Niiten Ryu, two-heavens school. He writes that the use of two swords is for when there are many enemies, but people practice a style of fencing with a sword in each hand to give practical advantage in fencing. Musashi used the words two swords when meaning to use all one's resources in combat. He never used two swords when up against a skilled swordsman. Oral tradition. Other kendo schools also have oral traditions, as opposed to teachings passed on in formal technique. F1 cut. Whatever this means, it is worthwhile to note the Hitatsu Gachi, one victory, the Kiriatashi technique of the Ito Ryu school, where one cut provides attack and defense, cutting down the enemy's sword and spirit, and the related Ichi no Tachi, long sword of one, of the Shinto style. Deliberately, with a patient spirit, absorb the virtue of all this, from time to time raising your hand in combat. Maintain this spirit whenever you cross swords with an enemy. Step by step walk the 1,000-mile road. Study strategy over the years and achieve the spirit of the warrior. Today is victory over yourself of yesterday, tomorrow is your victory over lesser men. Next, in order to beat more skillful men, train according to this book, not allowing your heart to be swayed along a side track. Even if you kill an enemy, if it is not based on what you have learned, it is not the true way. If you attain this way of victory, then you will be able to beat several tens of men. What remains is sword fighting ability, which you can attain in battles and duels. The second year of Shoho, the 12th day of the 5th contest be decided, as with the folding fan, merely by the span of their forearms. They specialize in the small matter of dexterity, learning such trifles as hand and leg movements with the bamboo practice sword. In my strategy, the training for killing enemies is by way of many contests, fighting for survival, discovering the meaning of life and death, learning the way of the sword, judging the strength of attacks, and understanding the way of the edge and ridge of the sword. You cannot profit from small techniques, particularly when full armor is worn. My way of strategy is the sure method to win when fighting for your life, one man against 5 or 10. There is nothing wrong with the principle one man can beat 10, so 1,000 men can beat 10,000. You must research this. Of course, you cannot assemble 1,000 or 10,000 men for everyday training. But you can become a master of strategy by training alone with a sword, so that you can understand the enemy's strategies, his strength and resources, and come to appreciate how to apply strategy to beat 10,000 enemies. Any man who wants to master the essence of my strategy must research diligently, training morning and evening. Thus can he polish his skill, become free from self, and realize extraordinary ability. He will come to possess miraculous power. Stand in the sun, that is, take up an attitude with the sun behind you. If the situation does not allow this, you must try to keep the sun on your right side. In buildings, you must stand with the entrance behind you or to your right. Make sure that your rear is unobstructed and that there is free space on your left, your right side being occupied with your sword attitude. At night, if the enemy can be seen, keep the fire behind you and the entrance to your right, and otherwise take up your attitude as above. You must look down on the enemy and take up your attitude on slightly higher places. For example, the bamboo practice sword. There have been practice swords of various kinds throughout the history of kendo. Some are made of spliced bamboo covered with cloth or hide. Full armor. The words rokugu, 6 pieces, are used. This is a set of armor consisting of cuirass, gauntlets, sleeves, apron and thigh pieces, or, according to another convention, body armor, helmet, mask, thigh pieces, gauntlets and leg pieces. Camisa in a house is thought of as a high place. When the fight comes, always endeavor to chase the enemy around to your left side. Chase him towards awkward places and try to keep him with his back to awkward places. When the enemy gets into an inconvenient position, do not let him look around, but conscientiously chase him around and pin him down. In houses, chase the enemy into the thresholds, lintels, doors, verandas, pillars, and so on, again not letting him see his situation. Always chase the enemy into bad footholds, obstacles at the side, and so on, using the virtues of the place to establish predominant positions from which to fight. You must research and train diligently in this. The 3 methods to forestall the enemy. 48. The first is to forestall him by attacking. This is called ken no sen, to set him up. Another method is to forestall him as he attacks. This is called tai no sen, to wait for the initiative. The other method is when you and the enemy attack together. This is called tai no sen, to accompany him and forestall him. There are no methods of taking the lead other than these 3. Because you can win quickly by taking the lead, it is one of the most important things in strategy. There are several things involved in taking the lead. You must make the best of the situation, see through the enemy's spirit, so that you grasp his strategy and defeat him. It is impossible to write about this in detail. The first ken no senator, when you decide to attack, keep calm and dash in quickly, forestalling the enemy. Or you can advance seemingly strongly, but with a reserved spirit, forestalling him with the reserve. Alternately, advance with as strong a spirit as possible, and when you reach the enemy, move with your feet a little quicker than normal, unsettling him and overwhelming him sharply. Or, with your spirit calm, attack with a feeling of constantly crushing the enemy, from first to last. When the enemy attacks, remain undisturbed but feign weakness. As the enemy reaches you, suddenly move away, indicating that you intend to jump aside, then dash and attacking strongly as soon as you see the enemy relax. This is one way. Kazima. This is the residence of the ancestral spirit of a house. The head of the house sits nearest this place. It is often a slightly raised recess in a wall, sometimes containing a hanging scroll, armor, or other religious property. The 3 methods to forestall an enemy. A great swordsman or other artist will have mastered the ability to forestall the enemy. The great swordsman is always before his environment. This does not mean speed. You cannot beat a good swordsman because he subconsciously sees the origin of every real action. One can still see in kendo practice wonderful old gentlemen slowly hitting young champions on the head almost casually. It is the practiced ability to sum up a changing situation instantly. Or, as the enemy attacks, attack more strongly, taking advantage of the resulting disorder in his timing to win. This is the tai no sen principle. The third tai no senator. When the enemy makes a quick attack, you must attack strongly and calmly, aim for his weak point as he draws near, and strongly defeat him. Or, if the enemy attacks calmly, you must observe his movement and, with your body rather floating, join in with his movements as he draws near. Move quickly and cut him strongly. This is tai no senator. These things cannot be clearly explained in words. You must research what is written here. In these 3 ways of forestalling, you must judge the situation. This does not mean that you always attack first, but if the enemy attacks first, you can lead him around. In strategy, you have effectively won when you forestall the enemy, so you must train well to attain this. To hold down a pillow. To hold down a pillow means not allowing the enemy's head to rise. In contests of strategy, it is bad to be led about by the enemy. You must always be able to lead the enemy about. Obviously, the enemy will also be thinking of doing this, but he cannot forestall you if you do not allow him to come out. In strategy, you must stop the enemy as he attempts to cut, you must push down his thrust and throw off his hold when he tries to grapple. This is the meaning of to hold down a pillow. When you have grasped this principle, whatever the enemy tries to bring about in the fight, you will see in advance and suppress it. The spirit is to check his attack at the syllable, when he jumps check his advance at the syllable Jew and check his cut at cubic . The important thing in strategy is to suppress the enemy's useful actions, but allow his useless actions. However, doing this alone is defensive. First, you must act according to the way, suppress the enemy's techniques, foiling his plans, and thence command him directly. When you can do this, you will be a master of strategy. You must train well and research holding down a pillow. Crossing at a ford means, for example, crossing the sea at a strait, or crossing over 100 miles of broad sea at a crossing place. I believe this crossing at a ford occurs often in a man's lifetime. It means setting sail even though your friends stay in harbor, knowing the route, knowing the soundness of your ship and the favor of the day. When all the conditions are met, and there is perhaps a favorable wind or a tailwind, then set sail. If the wind changes within a few miles of your destination, you must row across the remaining distance without sail. To hold down a pillow? Note that samurai and Japanese ladies slept with heads on a small wooden pillow shaped to accommodate their hairstyle. If you attain this spirit, it applies to everyday life. You must always think of crossing at a ford. In strategy also it is important to cross at a ford. Discern the enemy's capability and, knowing your own strong points, cross the ford at the advantageous place, as a good captain crosses a sea route. If you succeed in crossing at the best place, you may take your ease. To cross at a ford means to attack the enemy's weak point and to put yourself in an advantageous position. This is how to win in large-scale strategy. The spirit of crossing at a ford is necessary in both large and small-scale strategy. You must research this. To know the times means to know the enemy's disposition in battle. Is it flourishing or waning? By observing the spirit of the enemy's men and getting the best position, you can work out the enemy's disposition and move your men accordingly. You can win through this principle of strategy, fighting from a position of advantage. When in a duel, you must forestall the enemy and attack when you have first recognized his school of strategy, perceived his quality and his strong and weak points. Attack in an unsuspected manner, knowing his meter and modulation and the appropriate timing. Knowing the times means, if your ability is high, seeing right into things. If you are thoroughly conversant with strategy, you will recognize the enemy's intentions and thus have many opportunities to win. You must sufficiently study this. To tread down the sword is a principle often used in strategy. First, in large-scale strategy, when the enemy first discharges bows and guns and then attacks, it is difficult for us to attack if we are busy loading powder into our guns or notching our arrows. The spirit is to attack quickly, while the enemy is still shooting with bows or guns. The spirit is to win by treading down as we receive the enemy's attack. In single combat, we cannot get a decisive victory by cutting, with a t-dum feeling, in the wake of the enemy's attacking long sword. We must defeat him at the start of his attack, in the spirit of treading him down with the feet, so that he cannot rise again to the attack. Treading does not simply mean treading with the feet. Tread with the body, tread with the spirit, and, of course, tread and cut with the long sword. You must achieve the spirit of not allowing the enemy to attack a second time. This is the spirit of forestalling in every sense. Once at the enemy, you should not aspire just to strike him, but to cling after the attack. You must study this deeply. To know collapse, everything can collapse. Houses, bodies, and enemies collapse when their rhythm becomes deranged. In large-scale strategy, when the enemy starts to collapse, you must pursue him without letting the chance go. If you fail to take advantage of your enemy's collapse, they may recover. In single combat, the enemy sometimes loses timing and collapses. If you let this opportunity pass, he may recover and not be so negligent thereafter. Fix your eye on the enemy's collapse and chase him, attacking so that you do not let him recover. You must do this. The chasing attack is with a strong spirit. You must utterly cut the enemy down so that he does not recover his position. You must understand utterly how to cut down the enemy. To become the enemy means to think yourself into the enemy's position. In the world, people tend to think of a robber trapped in a house as a fortified enemy. However, if we think of becoming the enemy, we feel that the whole world is against us and that there is no escape. He who is shut inside is a pheasant. He who enters to arrest is a hawk. You must appreciate this. In large-scale strategy, people are always under the impression that the enemy is strong and so tend to become cautious. But if you have good soldiers, and if you understand the principles of strategy, and if you know how to beat the enemy, there is nothing to worry about. In single combat also, you must put yourself in the enemy's position. If you think, here is a master of the way, who knows the principles of strategy, then you will surely lose. You must consider this deeply. To release four hands degrees is used when you and the enemy are contending with the same spirit and the issue cannot be decided. Abandon this spirit and win through an alternative resource. In large-scale strategy, when there is a four-hands spirit, do not give up it is man's existence. Immediately throw away this spirit and win with a technique the enemy does not expect. In single combat also, when we think we have fallen into the four-hands situation, we must defeat the enemy by changing our mind and applying a suitable technique according to his condition. You must be able to judge in single combat if the enemy takes up a rear or side attitude of the long sword so that you cannot see his intention, make a feint attack, and the enemy will show his long sword, thinking he sees your spirit. Benefiting from what you are shown, you can win with 5 to release 4 Herods. Yatsu to hinasu. The expression yatsu ti means the condition of grappling witty body arms engaged with the opponent's arms, or deadlockl. It is also the name used to describe various articles with 4 corners joined, such as a fishing net, and was given to an article of ladies' clothing, which consisted of a square of cloth tied from the back over each shoulder and under each arm, with a knot on the breast. Certainty. If you are negligent, you will miss the timing. Research this well. To hold down a shadow. Holding down a shadow is used when you can see the enemy's attacking spirit. In large-scale strategy, when the enemy embarks on an attack, if you make a show of strongly suppressing his technique, he will change his mind. Then, altering your spirit, defeat him by forestalling him with a void spirit. Or, in single combat, hold down the enemy's strong intention with a suitable timing, and defeat him by forestalling him with this timing. You must study this well. To pass on. Many things are said to be passed on. Sleepiness can be passed on, and yawning can be passed on. Time can be passed on also. In large-scale strategy, when the enemy is agitated and shows an inclination to rush, do not mind in the least. Make a show of complete calmness, and the enemy will be taken by this and will become relaxed. When you see that this spirit has been passed on, you can bring about the enemy's defeat by attacking strongly with a void spirit. In single combat, you can win by relaxing your body and spirit, and then, catching on the moment the enemy relaxes, attack strongly and quickly, forestalling him. What is known as getting someone drunk is similar to this. You can also infect the enemy with a bored, careless, or weak spirit. You must study this well. To cause loss of balance. Many things can cause a loss of balance. One cause is danger, another is hardship, and another is surprise. You must research this. In large-scale strategy, it is important to cause loss of balance. Attack without warning where the enemy is not expecting it, and while his spirit is undecided, follow up your advantage and, having the lead, defeat him. Or, in single combat, start by making a show of being slow, then suddenly attack strongly. Without allowing him space for breath to recover from the fluctuation of spirit, you must grasp the opportunity to win. Get the feel of this. To frighten. Fright often occurs, caused by the unexpected. In large-scale strategy, you can frighten the enemy not by what you present to their eyes, but by shouting, making a small force seem large, or by threatening them from the flank without warning. These things all frighten. You can win by making best use of the enemy's frightened rhythm. In single combat, also, you must use the advantage of taking the enemy unawares by frightening him with your body, long sword, or voice, to defeat him. You should research this well. To soak in. When you have come to grips and are striving together with the enemy, and you realize that you cannot advance, you soak in and become one with the enemy. You can win by applying a suitable technique while you are mutually entangled. In battles involving large numbers as well as in fights with small numbers, you can often win decisively with the advantage of knowing how to soak into the enemy, whereas, were you to draw apart, you would lose the chance to win. Research this well. To injure the corners. It is difficult to move strong things by pushing directly, so you should injure the corners. In large-scale strategy, it is beneficial to strike at the corners of the enemy's force. If the corners are overthrown, the spirit of the whole body will be overthrown. To defeat the enemy, you must follow up the attack when the corners have fallen. In single combat, it is easy to win once the enemy collapses. This happens when you injure the corners of his body, and this weaken him. It is important to know how to do this, so you must research this deeply. To throw into confusion. This means making the enemy lose resolve. In large-scale strategy, we can use your troops to confuse the enemy on the field. Observing the enemy's spirit, we can make him think, here, there. Like in single combat, we can confuse the enemy by attacking with varied techniques when the chance arises. Feign to thrust or cut, or make the enemy think you are going close to him, and when he is confused you can easily win. This is the essence of fighting, and you must research it deeply. The three shouts are divided thus: before, during and after. Shout according to the situation. The voice is a thing of life. We shout against fires and so on, against the wind and the waves. The voice shows energy. And large-scale strategy, at the start of battle we shout as loudly as possible. During the fight, the voice is low-pitched, shouting out as we attack. After the contest, we shout in the wake of our victory. These are the three shouts. In single combat, we make as if to cut and shout at the same time to disturb the enemy, then in the wake of our shout we cut with the long sword. We shout after we have cut down the enemy, this is to announce victory. This is called sengo no ko, before and after voice. We do not shout simultaneously with flourishing the long sword. We shout during the fight to get into rhythm. Research this deeply. To mingle in battles, when the armies are in confrontation, attack the enemy's strong points, and, when you see that they are beaten back, quickly separate and attack yet another strong point on the periphery of his force. The spirit of this is like a winding mountain path. This is an important fighting method for one man against many. Strike down the enemies in one quarter, or drive them back, then grasp the timing and attack further strong points to right and left, as if on a winding mountain path, weighing up the enemy's disposition. When you know the enemy's level, attack strongly with no trace of retreating spirit. In single combat, too, use this spirit with the enemy's strong points. What is meant by mingling is the spirit of advancing and becoming engaged with the enemy, and not withdrawing even one step. You must understand this. To crush this means to crush the enemy regarding him as being weak. In large-scale strategy, when we see that the enemy has few men, or if he has many men but his spirit is weak and disordered, we knock the hat over his eyes, crushing him utterly. If we crush lightly, he may recover. You must learn the spirit of crushing as if with a hand grip. In single combat, if the enemy is less skillful than yourself, if his rhythm is disorganized, or if he has fallen into evasive or retreating attitudes, we must crush him straight away, with no concern for his presence, and without allowing him space for breath. It is essential to crush him all at once. The primary thing is not to let him recover his position even a little. You must research this deeply. The mountain sea change, the mountain sea spirit, means that it is bad to repeat the same thing several times when fighting the enemy. There may be no help but to do something twice, but do not try it a third time. If you once make an attack and fail, there is little chance of success if you use the same approach again. If you attempt a technique which you have previously tried unsuccessfully and fail yet again, then you must change your attacking method. If the enemy thinks of the mountains, attack like the sea, and if he thinks of the sea, attack like the mountains. You must research this deeply. To penetrate the depths when we are fighting with the enemy, even when it can be seen that we can win on the surface with the benefit of the way, if his spirit is not extinguished, he may be beaten superficially yet undefeated in spirit deep inside. With this principle of penetrating the depths, we can destroy the enemy's spirit in its depths, demoralizing him by quickly changing our spirit. This often occurs. Penetrating the depths means penetrating with the long sword, penetrating with the body, and penetrating with the spirit. This cannot be understood in a generalization. Once we have crushed the enemy in the depths, there is no need to remain spirited. But otherwise we must remain spirited, and a fresh spirit then win in the new rhythm. To renew, when we are deadlocked with the enemy, means that without changing our circumstance, we change our spirit and win through a different technique. It is necessary to consider how to renew also applies in large-scale strategy. Research this diligently. Rat's head, ox's neck. Rat's head and ox's neck means that, when we are fighting with the enemy and both he and we have become occupied with small points in an entangled spirit, we must always think of the way of strategy as being both a rat's head and an ox's neck. Whenever we have become preoccupied with small details, we must suddenly change into a large spirit, interchanging large with small. This is one of the essences of strategy. It is necessary that the warrior think in this spirit in everyday life. You must not depart from this spirit in large-scale strategy nor in single combat. The commander knows the troops. The commander knows the troops applies everywhere in fights in my way of strategy. Using the wisdom of strategy, think of the enemy as your own troops. When you think in this way you can move him at will and be able to chase him around. You become the general and the enemy becomes your troops. You must master this. To let go the hilt, there are various kinds of spirit involved in letting go the hilt. There is the spirit of winning without a sword. There is also the spirit of holding the long sword but not winning. The various methods cannot be expressed in writing. You must train well. The body of a rock. When you have mastered the way of strategy, you can suddenly make your body like a rock, and 10,000 things cannot touch you. This is the body of a rock. You will not be moved. Oral tradition. What is recorded above is what has been constantly on my mind about Ichi School's sword fencing, written down as it came to me. This is the first time I have written about my 51 the body of Tfirok. This is recorded in the Terao Kakai, the chronicle of the house of Terao. Once, a lord asked Musashi, "What is this body of a rock?" Musashi replied, "Please summon my pupil Terao Ryumasuk." When Terao appeared, Musashi ordered him to kill himself by cutting his abdomen. Just as Terao was about to make the cut, Musashi restrained him and said to the lord, "This is the body of the rock." Technique and the order of things is a bit confused. It is difficult to express it clearly. This book is a spiritual guide for the man who wishes to learn the way. My heart has been inclined to the way of strategy from my youth onwards. I have devoted myself to training my hand, tempering my body, and attaining the many spiritual attitudes of sword fencing. If we watch men of other schools discussing theory and concentrating on techniques with the hands, even though they seem skillful to watch, they have not the slightest true spirit. Of course, men who study in this way think they are training the body and spirit, but it is an obstacle to the true way, and its bad influence remains forever. Thus the true way of strategy is becoming decadent and dying out. The true way of sword fencing is the craft of defeating the enemy in a fight, and nothing other than this. If you attain and adhere to the wisdom of my strategy, you need never doubt that you will win. The second year of Shoho, the 5th month, the 12th day, 1645, Teruo Maganoho Shinman Musashi. The Wind Book and Strategy. You must know the ways of other schools, so I have written about various other traditions of strategy in this The Wind Book. Without knowledge of the ways of other schools, it is difficult to understand the essence of my Ichi school. Looking at other schools, we find some that specialize in techniques of strength using extra long swords. Some schools study the way of the short sword, known as kodachi. Some schools teach dexterity in large numbers of sword techniques, teaching attitudes of the sword as the surface and the way as the interior. That none of these are the true way I show clearly in the interior of this book all the vices and virtues and rights and wrongs. My Ichi school is different. Other schools make accomplishments their means of livelihood, growing flowers and decoratively coloring articles in order to sell them. This is definitely not the way of strategy. Some of the world's strategists are concerned only with sword fencing and limit their training to flourishing the long sword and carriage of the body. But is dexterity alone sufficient to win? I have recorded the unsatisfactory points of other schools one by one in this book. You must study these matters deeply to appreciate the benefit of my Knight Ichi school. Other schools using extra long swords. Some other schools have a liking for extra long swords. From the point of view of my strategy, these must be seen as weak schools. This is because they do not appreciate the principle of cutting the enemy by any means. Their preference is for the extra long sword and, relying on the virtue of its length, they think to defeat the enemy from a distance. In this world it is said, 1 inch gives the hand advantage, but these are the idle words of one who does not know strategy. It shows the inferior strategy of a weak spirit that men should be dependent on the length of their sword, fighting from a distance without the benefit of strategy. I expect there is a case for the school in question liking extra long swords as part of its doctrine, but if we compare this with real life, it is unreasonable. Surely we need not necessarily be defeated if we are using a short sword and have no long sword? It is difficult for these people to cut the enemy when at close quarters because of the length of the long sword. The blade path is large, so the long sword is an encumbrance, and they are at a disadvantage compared to the man armed with a short companion sword. From olden times it has been said, great and small go together. So do not unconditionally dislike extra long swords. What I dislike is the inclination towards the long sword. If we consider large-scale strategy, we can think of large forces in terms of long swords and small forces as short swords. Cannot few men give battle against many? There are many instances of few men overcoming many. Your strategy is of no account if when called on to fight in a confined space, your heart is inclined to the long sword, or if you are in a house armed only with your companion sword. Besides, some men have not the strength of others. In my doctrine, I dislike preconceived, narrow spirit. You must study this well. The strong long sword spirit in other schools, you should not speak of strong and weak long swords. If you just wield the long sword in a strong spirit, your cutting will become coarse, and if you use the sword coarsely, you will have difficulty in winning. If you are concerned with the strength of your sword, you will try to cut unreasonably strongly and will not be able to cut at all. It is also bad to try to cut strongly when testing the sword. Whenever you cross swords with an enemy, you must not think of cutting him either strongly or weakly, just think of cutting and killing him. Be intent solely on killing the enemy. Do not try to cut strongly and, of course, do not think of cutting weakly. You should only be concerned with killing the enemy. If you rely on strength, when you hit the enemy's sword you will inevitably hit too hard. If you do this, your own sword will be carried along as a result. Thus the saying, "the strongest hand wins," has no meaning. In large-scale strategy, if you have a strong army and are relying on strength to win, but the enemy also has a strong army, the battle will be fierce. This is the same for both sides. Without the correct principle, the fight cannot be won. The spirit of my school is to win through the wisdom of strategy, paying no attention to trifles. Study this well. Use of the shorter long sword. In other schools, using a shorter long sword is not the true way to win. In ancient times, tachi and katana meant long and short swords. Men of superior strength in the world can wield even a long sword lightly, so there is no case for their liking the short sword. They also make use of the length of spears and halberds. Some men use a shorter long sword with the intention of jumping in and stabbing the enemy at the unguarded moment when he flourishes his sword. This inclination is bad. To aim for the enemy's unguarded moment is completely defensive and undesirable at close quarters with the enemy. Furthermore, you cannot use the method of jumping inside as defense with a short sword if there are many enemies. Some men think that if they go against many enemies with a short or long sword, they can unrestrictedly frisk around cutting. The sure way to win thus is to chase the enemy around in a confusing manner, causing him to jump aside, with your body held strongly and straight. The same principle applies to large-scale strategy. The essence of strategy is to fall upon the enemy in large numbers and to bring about his speedy downfall. By their study of strategy, people of the world get used to countering, evading and retreating as the normal thing. They become set in this habit, so can easily be paraded around by the enemy. The way of strategy is straight and true. You must chase the enemy around and make him obey your spirit. Other schools with many methods of using the long sword, I think it is Leeldenadier Sklyolstliet, there are many methods of using the long sword in order to gain the admiration of beginners. This is selling the way. It is a vile spirit in strategy. The reason for this is that to deliberate over many ways of cutting down a man is an error. To start with, killing is not the way of mankind. Killing is the same for people who know about fighting and for those who do not. It is the same for women or children, and there are not many different methods. We can speak of different tactics such as stabbing and mowing down, but none other than these. Anyway, cutting down the enemy is the way of strategy, and there is no need for many refinements of it. Even so, according to the place, your long sword may be obstructed above or to the sides, so you will need to hold your sword in such manner that it can be used. There are 5 methods in 5 directions. Methods apart from these 5, hand twisting, body bending, jumping out, and so on, to cut the enemy are not the true way of strategy. In order to cut the enemy you must not make twisting or bending cuts. This is completely useless. In my strategy, I bear my spirit and body straight and cause the enemy to twist and bend. The necessary spirit is to win by attacking the enemy when his spirit is warped. You must study this well. Use of attitudes of the long sword in other schools, placing a great deal of importance on the attitudes of the long sword, is a mistaken way of thinking. What is known in the world as attitude applies when there is no enemy. The reason is that this has been a precedent since ancient times, that there should be no such thing as, this is the modern way to do it, dueling. You must force the enemy into inconvenient situations. Attitudes are for situations in which you are not to be moved. That is, for garrisoning castles, battle array, and so on, showing the spirit of not being moved even by a strong assault. In the way of dueling, however, you must always be intent upon taking the lead and attacking. Attitude is the spirit of awaiting an attack. You must appreciate this. In duels of strategy you must move the opponent's attitude. Attack where his spirit is lax, throw him into confusion, irritate and terrify him. Take advantage of the enemy's rhythm when he is unsettled and you can win. I dislike the defensive spirit known as attitude. Therefore, in my way, there is something called attitude, no attitude. In large-scale strategy we deploy our troops for battle bearing in mind our strength, observing the enemy's numbers, and noting the details of the battlefield. This is at the start of the battle. The spirit of attacking is completely different from the spirit of being attacked. Bearing an attack well, with a strong attitude, and parrying the enemy's attack well, is like making a wall of spears and halberds. When you attack the enemy, your spirit must go to the extent of pulling the stakes out of a wall and using them as spears and halberds. You must examine this well. Fixing the eyes. In other schools, some schools maintain that the eyes should be fixed on the enemy's long sword. Some schools fix the eye on the hands. Some fix the eyes on the face, and some fix the eyes on the feet, and so on. If you fix the eyes on these places, your spirit can become confused and your strategy thwarted. I will explain this in detail. Footballers do not fix their eyes on the ball, but by good play on the field they can perform well. When you become accustomed to something, they can see naturally. In the way of strategy, when you have fought many times, you will easily be able to appraise the speed and position of the enemy's sword, and having mastery of the way, you will see the weight of his spirit. In strategy, fixing the eyes means gazing at the man's heart. In large-scale strategy, the area to watch is the enemy's strength. Perception and sight are the two methods of seeing. Perception consists of concentrating strongly on the enemy's spirit, observing the condition of the battlefield, fixing the gaze strongly, seeing the progress of the fight, and the changes of advantage. This is the sure way to win. In single combat, you must not fix the eyes on details. As I said before, if you fix your eyes on details and neglect important things, your spirit will become bewildered and victory will escape you. Research this principle well and train diligently. Use of the feet. In other schools, there are various methods of using the feet. Floating foot, jumping foot, springing foot, treading foot, crow's foot, and such nibble walking methods. From the point of view of my strategy, these are all unsatisfactory. I dislike floating foot because the feet always tend to float during the fight. The way must be trod firmly. Neither do I like jumping foot because it encourages the habit of jumping and a jumpy spirit. However much you jump, there is no real justification for it, so jumping is bad. Springing foot causes a springing spirit which is indecisive. Treading foot is a waiting method, and I especially dislike it. Apart from these, there are various fast walking methods, such as crow's foot, and so on. Sometimes, however, you may encounter the enemy on marshland, swampy ground, river valleys, stony ground, or narrow roads, in which situations you cannot jump or move the feet quickly. In my strategy, the footwork does not change. I always walk as I usually do in the street. You must never lose control of your feet. According to the enemy's rhythm, move faster slowly, adjusting your body not too much and not too little. Carrying the feet is important also in large-scale strategy. This is because, if you attack quickly and thoughtlessly without knowing the enemy's spirit, your rhythm will become deranged and you will not be able to win. Or, if you advance too slowly, you will not be able to take advantage of the enemy's disorder, the opportunity to win will escape, and you will not be able to finish the fight quickly. You must win by seizing upon the 52 footballers. Football was a court game in ancient Japan. There is a reference to it in Genji Monogatari. Enemy's disorder and derangement, and by not according him even a little hope of recovery. Practice this well. Speed. In other schools, speed is not part of the true way of strategy. Speed implies that things seem fast or slow, according to whether or not they are in rhythm. Whatever the way, the master of strategy does not appear fast. Some people can walk as fast as 100 or 120 miles in a day, but this does not mean that they run continuously from morning till night. Unpracticed runners may seem to have been running all day, but their performance is poor. In the way of dance, accomplished performers can sing while dancing, but when beginners try this they slow down, and their spirit becomes busy. The old pine tree melody beaten on a leather drum is tranquil, but when beginners try this they slow down, and their spirit becomes busy. Very skillful people can manage a fast rhythm, but it is bad to beat hurriedly. If you try to beat too quickly you will get out of time. Of course, slowness is bad. Really skillful people never get out of time, and are always deliberate and never appear busy. From this example, the principle can be seen. What is known as speed is especially bad in the way of strategy. The reason for this is that depending on the place, marsh or swamp and so on, it may not be possible to move the body and legs together quickly. Still less will you be able to cut quickly if you have a long sword in this situation. If you try to cut quickly, as if using a fan or short sword, you will not actually cut even a little. You must appreciate this. In large-scale strategy also, a fast busy spirit is undesirable. The spirit must be that of holding down a pillow, then you will not be even a little late. When your opponent is hurrying recklessly, you must act contrarily and keep calm. You must not be influenced by the opponent. Train diligently to attain this spirit. Train diligently to attain this spirit. Train diligently to attain this spirit. Train diligently to attain interior and surface. In other schools, there is no interior nor surface in strategy. The artistic accomplishments usually claim inner meaning and secret tradition, and interior and gait, but in combat, there is no such thing as fighting on the surface or cutting with the interior. When I teach my way, I first teach by training in techniques which are easy for the pupil to understand, a doctrine which is easy to understand. I gradually endeavor to explain the deep principle, points which it is hardly possible to comprehend, according to the pupil's progress. In any event, because the way to understanding is through experience, I do not speak of interior and gait. In this world, if you go into the mountains and decide to go deeper and yet deeper, instead you will emerge at the gate. Whatever is the way, it has an interior, and it is sometimes a good thing to point out the gate. In strategy, we cannot say what is concealed and what is revealed. Accordingly, I dislike passing on my way through written pledges and regulations. Perceiving the ability of my pupils, I teach the direct way, remove the bad influence of other schools, and gradually introduce them to the true way of the warrior. 53 Old Pine Tree. Komatsu Bushi, an old tune for flute or lyre. Gate. A student enrolling in a school would pass through the gate of the dojo. To enter a teacher's gate means to take up a course of study. The method of teaching my strategy is with a trustworthy spirit. You must train diligently. I have tried to record an outline of the strategy of other schools in the above 9 sections. I could now continue by giving a specific account of these schools one by one, from the gate to the interior, but I have intentionally not named the schools or their main points. The reason for this is that different branches of schools give different interpretations of the doctrines. Inasmuch as men's opinions differ, so there must be differing ideas on the same matter. Thus no one man's conception is valid for any school. I have shown the general tendencies of other schools on 9 points. If we look at them from an honest viewpoint, we see that people always tend to like long swords or short swords and become concerned with strength in both large and small matters. You can see why I do not deal with the gates of other schools. In Maiichi school of the long sword there is neither gate nor interior. There is no inner meaning in sword attitudes. You must simply keep your spirit true to realize the virtue of strategy. 12th day of the 5th month, the 2nd year of Shoho, 1645, Teruo Maganoho Shinmin Musashi. The Book of the Void. The Naiichi way of strategy is recorded in this, the Book of the Void. What is called the spirit of the void is where there is nothing. It is not included in man's knowledge. Of course, the void is nothingness. By knowing things that exist, you can know that which does not exist. That is the void. People in this world look at things mistakenly and think that what they do not understand must be the void. This is not the true void. It is bewilderment. In the way of strategy, also, those who study as warriors think that whatever they cannot understand in their craft is the void. This is not the true void. To attain the way of strategy as a warrior, you must study fully other martial arts and not deviate even a little from the way of the warrior. With your spirit settled, accumulate practice day by day and hour by hour. Polish the twofold spirit, heart and mind, and sharpen the twofold gaze, perception and sight. When your spirit is not in the least clouded, when the clouds of bewilderment clear away, there is the true void. Until you realize the true way, whether in Buddhism or in common sense, you may think that things are correct and in order. However, if we look at things objectively, from the viewpoint of laws of the world, we see various doctrines departing from the true way. Know well this spirit, and with forthrightness as the foundation and the true spirit as the way. Enact strategy broadly, correctly and openly. Then you will come to think of things in a wide sense, and, taking the void as the way, you will see the way as void. And the void is virtue, and no evil. Wisdom has existence, principle has existence, the way has existence, spirit is nothingness. 12th day of the 5th month, 2nd year of Shoho, 1645, Teruo Maganoho Shinmin Musashi. Thank you very much for listening this audiobook.